Good evening, everyone. I'd like to show my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us. I'm Associate Professor Daniel Joyce from UNSW Law and Justice, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Legal Hour panel on misinformation in the media. As we navigate an era where information is abundant, yet often misleading, the discussions we'll have tonight are not just timely, but essential. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts with us this evening. Scientia Professor Megan Davis, Associate Professor Alyce McGovern, and two of our alumni, Kevin Lynch and Ben Doherty. I'm particularly grateful to Alyce McGovern for stepping in at the last moment to share her experience with us, as unfortunately Scientia Professor Jane McAdam is unwell and unable to join us. So I'd like to start by briefly introducing our panellists tonight. Scientia Professor Megan Davis is the Pro-Vice Chancellor Society at UNSW Sydney. Professor Davis is also a UNSW Scientia Professor and holds the Balnaves Chair in Constitutional Law and the Whitlam Fraser Harvard Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University, and is a visiting professor currently at Harvard Law School. Professor Davis is a renowned constitutional lawyer and public law expert, specialising on Indigenous peoples and the law, the constitutional recognition of First Nations, and democracy. We're so grateful to Megan for joining us online, although at the moment we are having some technical issues, so hopefully she will be able to patch in and join us shortly during her appointment at Harvard to share her insights in relation to misinformation in the media, especially during her leadership and work on constitutional recognition of First Nations. Dr. Alyce McGovern, who's here with us in person, is an Associate Professor in Criminology in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney. Her research is particularly relevant and explores intersecting themes of crime, media and culture, including police, public relations and image work, and police use of social media. Amongst her publications, she's the author of, or co-author rather, of Policing and Media, Public Relations, Simulations and Communications. The relationship between media, law and crime is an especially important dimension to the broader problem of misinformation and its impact on the legal system. And we're grateful to Alyce for joining us here to reflect on her innovative research in this area. Kevin Lynch, who's also here with us in person, is a partner with the law firm Johnson Winter Slattery. He is one of our leading media lawyers and has a great range and depth of expertise, including in relation to defamation law, contempt, broadcast regulation, and in many of the cutting-edge issues in media law. In fact, we were talking in my media law class today about some of the cases that Kevin has been involved in. And particularly those cases, I think, are really interesting where the traditional media law principles are being tested in these new digital media contexts, including landmark cases such as Dow Jones and Gutnick, Defteros and Google, and the recent litigation involving Australia's e-safety commissioner and Elon Musk's X-Corp. We're really fortunate to have Kevin here with us in person to share his media law expertise and to help us navigate the increasingly complex media law proposals to address misinformation, and also to consider the free speech dimension, which is a really significant aspect. Also joining us online, and you'll see him shortly, is Ben Doherty. Ben Doherty is an international affairs correspondent for the Guardian in Australia. He has wide experience reporting in the Asia-Pacific region, and his work is particularly notable for its focus on human rights, humanitarianism, forced migration, and asylum, and Ben has particular connections with our Caldor Centre, which is wonderful. Ben is a three-time winner of the very prestigious Walkley Award and also of the United Nations Association Media Peace Prize. He's a fellow of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, and has also written a really interesting novel, Nagaland. We're delighted to have Ben join us online to reflect on the media's role in misinformation, including also in countering it. So before we turn to some more broader questions for the panel, I just want to sort of set the scene for us in terms of this problem of misinformation. So misinformation has become a broad category used to describe a range of things, including fake news, propaganda and hate speech, selective or distorted bias and agendas in media framing, online misinformation and disinformation, and we're going to need to sort of unpack those categories a little bit, and a range of harms associated with social media, digital interference with our democratic processes, and so on. So already we can see that this is really quite a broad and elastic category, but one which has really significant impacts in these key particular areas, and where the law, I think, is struggling to work out how best to regulate. This is also a historical issue, with antecedents involving the manipulation of public opinion and incitement of violence. And in our time, these concerns have intensified in the context of digital platforms and their disruption of our media ecosystem. In recent years, as we all sadly know, particular attention was given to the impact of misinformation on public health during the COVID pandemic, in this year of elections internationally, and also with our own federal election looming. There is increasing attention being given to the damage to democracy and also social cohesion, where misinformation and disinformation can influence both our elections and also our politics more broadly. Misinformation is a significant problem in our public understanding of and response to the existential challenge of climate change, and also, and I think this will be interesting to talk to Alyce about, there is also the danger that misinformation may damage confidence in our legal system itself. So something that, as people interested in the law and legal education, we should really be taking seriously. So for our purposes, we're going to proceed with a fairly broad and simple definition of misinformation, that it is, quote, wrong or misleading information. But I think increasingly it's important to note that it is viewed as false information where the purveyor believes it to be true. So there's this sort of sense of misinformation as involving a certain innocence in terms of the disseminator, as contrasted with disinformation, which is seen to intentionally deceive or manipulate. Both obviously carry connection to harmful information, and it's interesting to think about whether our laws at present are able to capture all those different kinds of harms. So maybe we'll have a chance later to talk about current proposals with Kevin, but it's notable that the current proposal, the Communications Legislation Amendment, combating misinformation and disinformation, that's currently before the Parliament, does not attempt to deal with all of the harms of misinformation. So finally, the term fake news media has become a mechanism by which to damage the credibility of and public trust in the media as an institution. And certainly the media is a part of the problem we face with misinformation. Indeed, that's very much the focus of tonight's discussion. But are there also dangers associated with laying too much responsibility with the media? So having now set the scene, I want to turn to a bit more of a kind of relaxed panel session. Hopefully this microphone will be working. Welcome Megan as well. It's wonderful to have you joining us. And to Ben, I wanted to start with some broader, more introductory questions for the panel. And firstly, I guess to ask the panellists what they see are the key challenges currently posed in their areas by misinformation in the media.
Look, I think the key challenges are, we're talking about a media which involves now an incredible breadth of speed and spread. You're not talking about localised publications, you're not talking about micro communications over a back fence. It's a media which takes in an international purview and deals with issues of international importance in a way which can be extremely productive but also extremely dangerous. The other problem with misinformation in the media is that it leads to that erosion of trust that you spoke about in your introduction. And once you lose trust in those institutions, which used to certainly be treated with a level of scepticism, but in a situation where entire industries are held up to disrepute, then I think social fabric starts to suffer. The other thing from our point of view is, as lawyers, is that there's an incredible complexity involved, and regulation when you're talking about communications which happen instantaneously across borders and with a huge amount of openness in terms of engagement by those who don't have editors, don't have thresholds, don't have gatekeepers, poses real problems and challenges with the spread of misinformation in the media.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much, Kevin. That's really got us off to a good start. One of the questions I also had was maybe a question for Ben, and it'd be interesting to hear from Megan about this also, if you would like, was about the issue of balance in news coverage and whether this kind of, the way that balance is approached and the way that media coverage is framed in relation to balance can contribute actually to the problem of misinformation and distorted coverage rather than in fact seeking to provide alternative and different perspectives. Ben, would you like to start?
Davis, or I can go first. Look, I think you're exactly right. This is a real problem, this issue of false equivalence, I suppose. It's, I think, allied to the disinformation, misinformation problem, but it's a specific part of it. Look, I do think, coming from a journalist point of view, balance and objectivity is an important goal to strive for in your reporting, even if we do start from a position of understanding there's no such thing as a truly objective position. Everyone has a position. But I think attempting to understand alternate points of view in not eschewing nuance or difference of opinion, that's an important starting point. But I do think in journalism, you do need to exercise a level of editorial judgment. And you know, the simple fact is that not all opinions are equal. We see this, I suppose, most obviously in sort of climate change coverage. We might have 15 expert climate change scientists who've spent their lives dedicated to researching this area, and they say there is grave danger in the changing climate and the damage to the planet. But then, for balance, we feel we have to hear from, frankly, you know, an ill-informed conspiracy theorist saying, "Oh, it's all rubbish. It's all, the climate's always changed. It's always been hot. There's always been cyclones and hurricanes and these sorts of things." That's not balance. That's pandering, and the issue that does is it diminishes expert opinion and elevates inexpert opinion as though these things are equivalent, and that's somehow balance. And you've done your job as a journalist by presenting both sides of the argument fairly. Well, you haven't really informed your reader, your viewer, your listener by presenting these two things as though they're equal when they're simply not. You do need to exercise some editorial judgment.
That's fantastic, Ben. Megan, did you want to come in on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I could spend all night on it because it's one of
my
I
know it's an interesting.
I mean, yeah. I think it's interesting, the whole misinformation discussion, because we tried to raise it during the referendum, after the referendum, and it's taken, you know, kind of till now for people to realise just how significant it was in the referendum. It wasn't just actually that you know, we'd run a bad campaign or we'd done this or that. The misinformation was really significant, and it started, we think, around November 2022, well before when other people said it kicked in. Yes. And I think one of our issues leading into the campaign then was this false equivalence. I mean, it was impossible for us to articulate our case because journalists kept coming to us with the most farcical and, you know, absolutely offbeat questions that really they shouldn't have been asking. But all of it was from this kind of, oh, we need balance, we need yes and no. And as Ben's alluded to, and you have this false equivalence. And so I was at Hervey Bay in December 2022, just after Little Proud said no to The Voice. And I was getting calls from Bundaberg Radio and Bundaberg newspapers and asking me whether The Voice would take people's freehold land. Now, Advance, and I know we'll get to this, so I don't want to jump over it, but, you know, they had already started their misinformation with their fake kind of news station on Facebook that people looked at. But then after that, and as it continued, you know, the ABC especially constantly, so at UNSW, they emailed all of the Aboriginal staff at UNSW saying, we're really desperately looking for a no activist from La Perouse. Can someone find us one, please? Because we've got this debate coming up. And we would have to come up, you know, we'd have to do all of this kind of ABC interaction on the basis of the most ridiculous arguments that were not even plausible, legal, or anything else, arguments, but just because they wanted this balance. And then by the time you got to the last 6 weeks, commercial television wouldn't even run Yes, because unless No ran someone, unless Advance put up a speaker, they would not run anyone from the Yes case, and No just ran everything dead. And so we didn't even get to have any exposure in terms of media, but it was atrocious. And then once you got to the actual ballot box, the documents that were being handed out that were not actual legal documents that you can give out at a ballot box, with the most outrageous misinformation that Advance had already run, right, for the bulk of probably since about November 2022, were just distributed willy-nilly all over the country. I mean, I tweeted at the AEC and they sent an officer to confiscate them, but I don't think the nation ever was exposed to the legitimate reasons and explanations behind why the voice was needed. But they were absolutely, it was an avalanche of misinformation that they did get in relation to the voice, with these kind of false narratives that this, misinformation actually deepen these the divisions between supporters and opponents, which is not what the Uluru Statement from the Heart was about. So that's a kind of, Dan, a very long rant, but
no, it's a
think
powerful one.
The
Great.
media absolutely abdicated their responsibility, especially journalists, to read. They did not read. They did not read the expert panel report. They did not read the referendum council report. All they went off was Advance talking notes.
Well, I think, Megan, that's such a powerful set of reflections and insights into this problem, and it's such an important example to begin with, I think, because also one of the tensions, I think, that we see in the way that currently we discuss misinformation and disinformation is a focus in terms only of the online context. I mean, it's quite notable, actually, that our current proposals carve out the traditional media. And there are arguments for why that might be the case, but and the focus is very much on the digital platforms. But I think starting with the sense of how actually the media in a more kind of mainstream, also public media, public service broadcasting context has contributed to this problem, I think is really important and helpful for us. And it might be a sort of point to connect as well with Alyce and maybe others who want to come in on this too, because I note that, Megan, you were also talking about the interaction between traditional and digital social media as well. And so one of the questions I guess I did have for everyone, but perhaps Alyce could start with this, is whether this is a problem that is actually intensifying in the context of digital disruption, or is it just being resituated? And do we need to think about these contexts and these environments in different ways, or are there points of kind of commonality across the experience?
I mean, I would argue there's always been misinformation, and particularly, coming from that context of someone who's looking at representations of crime and criminal justice issues in the media. There's always been a kind of disconnect between what we know and what we see and read about in the media. I think social media, new forms of media, have just kind of exacerbated the issue, and misinformation spreads much more quickly now, and so it's harder to then, pull back from perhaps information spreading on Facebook, X, other platforms that might be incorrect, inaccurate. So I think it's not a new thing, but it's certainly expanded. And because we've, there's pros with social media. We've got, the democratization of media. We've got new voices, and so it opens us up to maybe perspectives that we wouldn't necessarily hear on traditional media platforms in the past. But there's the flip side of that in terms of, okay, well, how do I value and judge this information? And I know it's something I talk about with students a lot, about where they get their information from, how do they make assessments about the accuracy or otherwise of that information. So I think it's, expanded and accelerated really in those spaces. Fantastic.
Ben or Megan, did either of you want to kind of add to that in terms of the connections between the mainstream media and its issues here, but also then new forms of disrupted media?
I'm happy to go. Megan, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go, but you can go first.
No, you go. I'll go after you.
Well, I think it's true. I think social media added was an important contribution to the kind of media landscape in terms of Aboriginal policy, because by and large, up until the kind of advance of social media as a really key player in the space, journalists by and large and I'm talking about Aboriginal and Indigenous policy here, would kind of just run government press releases. And it's a really, really complex area of policy that we can see post-referendum has just turned back to running government press releases, but it's actually really super complex. And social media enabled people to challenge journalists and editors and newspapers for the positions that they took, and give critiques that normally people wouldn't see. And there was that kind of heyday, I thought, which was really important. But there's limits to that, and I think that was important, that particular period. But at some point, media, and again, I'm in some ways I'm returning to the point that I've already made. So misinformation, yes, it's always existed, but in particular in relation to the referendum, and a really key moment in Aboriginal history and Australian history, that kind of fundamental job to fact check and to make sure that what you're putting to the Yes campaign or to Aboriginal people is accurate and factual, like that just went out the window. And then it was just amplified in the most extraordinary way on social media, right across the platforms, that we just weren't expecting and we weren't prepared for. And so I think that's important in terms of fact checking. Yes. But yeah, I mean, I'll stop because I'll keep going. Ben, you can jump in.
We're going to return to some of these themes as well when I ask some specific questions too. So thanks so much, Megan. Ben.
Yeah, look, I think there are two key elements to this, the impact of technology, this digital disruption. One is what the technology itself is able to do, but also secondly, what that technology has done to traditional media, sort of on the other side, to traditional media operations, their business models, their resourcing, their journalistic practices. The whole media landscape has been upended. So for that first element, what the technology can do, as we've heard, misinformation, disinformation, that's always existed. Propaganda is nothing new. Manipulating the message, it's a pretty ancient art. But these modern technologies, the internet, social media, global messaging apps, they've turbocharged it. This is sort of misinformation on steroids. And, it's always sort of wrongly misattributed to Mark Twain. It doesn't matter where it came from. The lies halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Well, now the lies around the world 1 million times in an instant, and the truth simply never has the chance to catch up. And even if it does, how do you then distinguish that truth from the lie that's gone before it is harder and harder, And I apologise for my use of the vernacular here, but the Steve Bannon quote, to flood the zone with shit, that there's just so much information that you don't know what to believe, what's true, what's not. You're hearing so many conflicting arguments, and they all, are given the sort of same weight by that false equivalence we talked about before, that even for a discerning reader, listener, viewer trying to get to the bottom of this, it's a really hard thing to do. And you add to that this erosion of trust in the institutions and the authorities that were once a source of shared information. People don't trust government. People don't trust the people who run their elections. People don't trust the media. And in a lot of cases, to what Megan's been talking about, that's the media's fault. Like, we haven't carried these issues well. We haven't interrogated these issues as well as we could. But those sort of shared places of sort of, not communion, those shared places of trust, if they're labour unions and church groups or volunteer groups, where people can find a sort of, all people find now are these self-reinforcing groups online. And so they're just hearing their same worldview reflected back to them over and over again. And to the second point, just very quickly, I know I've talked a lot, but you run all of that in parallel with the demise of the former business models. Large companies with healthy balance sheets running, large, well-resourced newsrooms, working to what was a pretty slow, pretty benign news cycle back in the day. All of a sudden, you've got fewer and fewer journalists being asked to do more and more with less and less, to a news cycle that is just absolutely frenetic. And I suspect in Megan's case, when you're getting these questions from all of these journalists who are just parroting advanced talking points back at you, these are young journalists, they're not experts in the area, they don't have a background in it, and they're being sent out and saying, you need to file in half an hour. And so it's this sort of asymmetric fight. You've got this massive information flying around everywhere, and these old information channels are just completely unsuited to be able to deal with them. And so we end up with this kind of morass of information that is this swamp to kind of swim through. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was a bit all over the place.
That was fantastic, and
no,
I
it
think,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Kevin, I wanted to bring you into the discussion here too, in terms of your practice and what you see some of these themes, how they're playing out. You know, the themes around amplification and virality, for example, for media lawyers are obviously pretty challenging.
Absolutely, it's a very different dynamic to when I started out. Not just at work, but on my way to work, I used to read headlines over people's shoulders while they were reading the newspaper, and now everyone's got a phone, and literally that TikTok gets the attention of someone for about a quarter of a second before they move to the next screen, the next article, and if something does grab someone's attention, it might be for 4 seconds. And this is the consumption of media now. It's not dead tree media, it's not broadcast media, it really is a totally different dynamic. And you used the term in your question about digital disruption. It's really digital domination. And that means that there's not people talking to lawyers before they publish. None of those people who are creating content on TikTok, which is engaging those people on the bus, have spoken to a lawyer. None of them think about fact-checking. None of them have any interest or time to put something out there that's considered and worthwhile. It might be unfair to say none of them, but let's just say most of them. And for those that are in Ben's position, it's really hard to engage with an employer that's going to allow you to spend time thinking, working, talking to lawyers, getting things right, and to try and engage with that audience who are spending 3/4 of a second on the article that gets flashed by on their way to the juggling cats video or whatever it is that's taking their attention. So it is difficult, but it is the paradigm, and it's not disruption, it is either domination or devastation, depending on how you want to look at it.
Well, I think that's a really powerful reflection, and it links us back. I'm now going to turn to ask some more specific questions of each of our panellists. And I'd like to start with some questions from Megan. She's obviously begun to present a really powerful view of the impact of misinformation in and during the Voice referendum that I think is really important for our understanding of misinformation. And that was one of the reasons I was really keen for Megan to be able to be a part of the panel, because I think it is such a powerful example of the problem, but it's not necessarily one that is given all the attention that it deserves, particularly in the current regulatory environment. We're more sort of talking about, dangers for social media for young people and so on. And I think it's a useful chance for us now to hear more about the impact of misinformation, but also it's the broader dangers posed for democracy in terms of how that was experienced during the referendum, but what it also foreshadows, in a sense, in terms of our future elections and the future of the referendum project and those who wanted change. So I guess I was interested to ask a little bit about some of the key actors involved, and when you'd already talked a little bit, Megan, about when you first started to notice that shifting. How were you how are you thinking about how to respond? Because that's one of the big kind of conundrums of the present moment, is how can we respond to misinformation? What were the different strategies that you engage with? What worked? Would you do things, would you respond in different ways in the future? What are the kind of lessons that we can learn from that experience in a constructive sense, as well as the sort of critique?
Yeah, so as I said, we started noticing things around November 2022, not long after Little Proud said no to The Voice, which, at the time we thought was shocking because there was no detail on the table. But they'd already started their work on particularly Facebook. And I didn't really even notice until about January. My sister said, Megan, there's like, 300 anti, voice no campaigns, and there's this particular news channel that's all news about the referendum, but it's all negative, and like, you guys aren't even out there. I mean, I come from the Uluru Dialogue. I'm from UNSW. We weren't the main campaign. Yes, 23 was. So we didn't have the campaign money or the campaign resources, but we did say to them, this is a problem. And we said that to them over Christmas and New Year's. There was a kind of, and I've obviously been working on Conrec since 2011 when it first started with Gillard, and there was this kind of stock standard narrative that Aussies don't listen to the news over Christmas. So there's never any need to really run a campaign over that period because everyone's on holidays. And I mean, since Uluru, or before, the referendum and after the referendum, I've thought they've really got to get rid of that idea, because I remember thinking, well, hang on, everybody's lying there scrolling on the beaches and camping, like through Facebook and all of the different social media sites that people are on. And so it can't be that they're not paying any attention to political messaging. And I think by the time January, February came around, I think we probably had already lost that narrative debate. As I said, I was on holidays and was getting these phone calls from regional Queensland newspapers like in Bundaberg and Bundaberg Radio, asking me about the Voice and whether it was going to take, freehold property from Aussies, and it just continued on like that. It was completely kind of out of our control. And it was interesting to me that a lot of the professional lobbyists in the space and experts in the space that we were, go to this person, go to this, actually nobody could give us any proper advice on how to combat it. Now, that's probably not the case now because things move so quickly. And of course, at the time, I remember saying to Labor and whoever, it's a problem for us, and you might not think it's a problem for you, but it's going to become a problem for you. You just don't see it yet. But they see it, right? So I've had a lot of contact from Queenslanders, non-Indigenous mob this week, who are seeing the Queensland Electoral Commission put out all of these ads about misinformation so that Queenslanders can distinguish between what is fact and what is not fact. We'd asked for that, right? We said we are being absolutely pounded with misinformation. There has to be some way of putting out a public campaign so people can identify that. And the decision was not to do that. But it's interesting, the decision, they're taking it seriously now because their own electoral misfortunes are at risk. But I think for us at that time, it's easy to talk about what might we have done now. We know a lot more about misinformation now.
Of course.
But I think for us at the time, there was no clear way to counter misinformation. I didn't think the political class, or at least the government that supported us or people in that space, took it seriously enough. And every time I raised it, most people hadn't seen it. And that's because a lot of those people don't spend time on Facebook, right? So I was getting it from a lot of the mob. And then it started kicking off on TikTok. And then journalists kept coming back to us with these TikTok points. And I just want to make one point here, and that is the really interesting thing is our polling, our work, the really detailed and earnest work we did to get our mob on side. You would not know that from the media coverage because they were taking stuff from TikTok, Facebook, Twitter and saying Aboriginal people do not support this reform. One of the primary reasons Australians voted no was because they thought Aboriginal people didn't want the reform. When we did research with Essential not long ago, they still think Aboriginal people didn't want the reform. But what did the results tell us? They supported the polling that we had done beforehand. So we know that in most remote communities in the NT, for example, there was something like 80% of yes. I think out of the 20 ballot boxes, or it might be 21, there was all but one that voted no. All of them voted yes. And then the ANU study that did the overlay of the Aboriginal kind of population across the continent over the 151 electorates, found that in those electorates, it was either a yes or a really high yes vote. We know our people predominantly supported it, but because, misinformation and the way in which social media was able to manipulate, I'll quickly talk about advance sentiment in the community. most Australians went into it thinking our people didn't want it. So the last point I'll just make is Advance was really clever, right? They started really early. They got money outside of the statutory declaration period. They had this really clever, what looked like a neutral news site that had referendum news well before it was really in the consciousness of most Australians. And that had a huge influence on how people were reading the sentiment. So when they started, this was not a divisive issue. But the issue of division, they put that language into the community and journalists just picked it up. And as people had worked on this for 12 years, we could see it happening. We were like, why are you calling it divisive? There's no debate yet. But they framed the debate. And apart from their news site, they had about 3 or 4 other different no cases. So they ran multiple no campaigns and did a really effective job. They started early. And I don't think the Yes campaign was ready for it. We'd been told by ALP campaign experts that they expected the Trumpian misinformation to arrive on Australian shores in the 2019 election, and it didn't happen. And they thought it'd happen in the 2022 election, and it didn't happen. And then they were like, they were kind of ambivalent about what impact it had on our referendum. But we know with the research kind of flowing out this year and some of the analysis, lots of different books, lots of different pieces of research, particularly one of the most recent ones around the impact of, the 9,000 Chinese bots who kind of inundated the social media space as well in terms of anti-voice sentiment, that at that point, there was not a lot of expertise, in my view, in Australia that could help us combat it. But that's not the case now. And I'll shut up now, but I will say that I am firmly of the view that this needs to be regulated.
I did want to, that's very helpful, Megan. And I think we'll hear more from Kevin as well about what some of those proposals are. But I definitely think the mood is changing too. So there's much more of a kind of turn in that regulatory mood. And I guess it's a good point now to connect with Alyce and her work on misinformation, but also more broadly her work on how the media and our legal system, particularly the criminal justice system, interrelate. And I guess I wanted to sort of ask you, is misinformation becoming more of a kind of concern in that criminal justice context?
Yeah, I think it is. And again, I think it's kind of been for a little while. And I think the early days of social media did show that to justice agencies. And, when I was thinking about this session, I was thinking back to 2011 when Queensland Police Service used Twitter in particular, as it was known then, to kind of counter misinformation around the floods in Queensland, because a lot of people couldn't access information through kind of more traditional media formats. And so they were really, quick at coming out and sort of saying, no, this is actually what's going on, because there was a lot of kind of fear and concern and misinformation in that context. I think just more broadly, we've increasingly seen criminal justice agencies become much more media savvy, much more conscious of their kind of image in the media and the way that they need to kind of control narratives around, matters of criminal justice. The police have kind of been at the forefront of that, but increasingly we see courts and also corrections more recently kind of moving into that space. So being much more on the front foot and also kind of acknowledging that, the best way for them to get their information out is often not through traditional media formats, but engaging in these new media spaces. So Facebook, Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, all those spaces now are ways that they can have direct kind of connections with the public. They can bypass the media. They don't have to go through those filters of, is this newsworthy or not? Is this something that a journalist is going to report on? They can kind of directly engage with the public now. And so that gives them, I guess, a bit more capacity to engage not just with audiences, but different audiences. So, engaging on TikTok is going to give you access to a different kind of generation to Facebook as to Instagram. And I think they've become much more aware of how that allows them to tap into different audiences and try to speak to those audiences in their language. It doesn't always work. And also, you know, there's different ways that the criminal justice agencies do that, and I'm thinking in particular in the court space, the way that, say, the Victorian Supreme Court has their podcasts, so Gertie's Law, for example. So ways that they can also use those platforms as tools for education to kind of demystify, you know, what it is that these organisations do. There's a flip side to that, which I won't get into now, but certainly, you know, I think, you know, police in particular for a long time have been much more proactive in these spaces for reasons of misinformation as well as other factors as well.
That's really fascinating. So we sort of see the police, in a sense, becoming media or taking on some of these new media forms, engaging with podcasts, as you've been looking at in your research. And that can have, I guess, part of the issue that you know, Megan was talking about, and also Ben too, was this issue around literacy and civics, and some of the, you know, there's some positive effects there, but you've alluded as well, and I know we've got limits in terms of the time we have for the discussion, but to some of the negatives there as well, in terms of who gets to frame the narrative and
exactly.
So on.
Like, I think we need to be conscious that these are public relations activities.
Yeah.
So there are particular agendas in mind when engaging with these platforms in these spaces and speaking to particular audiences. And, you know, there's an important role that the media can play in, say, fact-checking or gatekeeping or, you know, holding these organisations and institutions to account, which we kind of miss out on if we're kind of only hearing about these things through their own platforms. You know, there's a lot of money and resources spent on, you know, having these podcasts, having, you know, full-time camera crew that can go out and film things, having these, you know, media units and corporate communications units that are essentially acting like a media organisation. They've become very mediatised and on the front foot, and particularly when we see a media that is under-resourced, understaffed, you know, it's very kind of helpful for the police or whoever to kind of give information or footage or whatever it might be. And we need to kind of be conscious when we're kind of seeing this stuff, you know, what might be the kind of purpose behind it. Who's creating this stuff? What do we need to be mindful of? It could be, you know, about sharing information warnings, but it could also be about, you know, making the police look good or trying to build trust and confidence.
Well, that's fantastic, Alyce. Look, I'm mindful that we've sort of got to, you know, we've got our hour, but I want to come to Kevin and then Ben to kind of finish the discussion with some particular questions, partly drawing on Megan's sense that something needs to be done in terms of regulation, and I think that's something that is very much a part of the broader discussion at the moment. And I'd like to ask Kevin, in your kind of experience as a media lawyer, how you're sort of seeing these trends emerge, and in a sense, is there a role for some of the more traditional mechanisms like defamation law to play a role, or actually, you know, are some of the new forms of regulatory sort of frameworks that we see with, you know, co-regulation and specific efforts to address misinformation online and so on, like how promising you think it is, but also how hard it is to advise in these areas. Like, is it law as we know it, or are these quite new environments for lawyers as well?
They're great questions. I can say, for starters, that the existing regime of law is not really fit for purpose for misinformation and disinformation. The main areas that are established are a very limited right to privacy. There's actions for breach of confidence, and most importantly, defamation. But defamation actually is a right of action for an individual, and so many of these misinformation campaigns are about communities, about disadvantaged. If you say that they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets, those Haitians in Springfield don't have a right to sue in defamation, even though each and every one of them have had their reputations traduced by that disinformation that's been put out there. Because defamation classically involves the identification of a particular person and says something negative about an act or condition or a personality trait of that person. It doesn't allow a class of people to bring an action. There are no class actions in defamation. So it's not only limited to individuals, it's costly, it's slow, and it's well after the event. You see the prominent cases of the last couple of years, and the cases are starting to slow down. Ben Roberts-Smith cost tens of millions of dollars for the players, both Ben Roberts-Smith as a plaintiff, an unsuccessful plaintiff, and Channel 9 as a successful defendant. Both of those will lose money on that, and the money is astronomical. The ABC is constantly having to make decisions about whether they can afford to tell public interest stories, because the cost of defending these matters can be astronomical. So it's commercial, and it's realistically difficult for an individual to defend a matter, and it's even more difficult for a person who is the victim of misinformation to bring a matter, because they're an individual against a very well-resourced and sometimes overseas-based entity. So that's the lie of the land now. We don't have anything really in place which is fit for purpose to deal with those broad international campaigns of misinformation or disinformation. And misinformation can be innocuous. It's if you crack your knuckles, you get arthritis. But disinformation, when it's intentional and goes out to say the eastern seaboard bushfires were caused by arsonists and not by climate change, or this vaccine will cause you to pick up 5G through your tooth fillings. Those kinds of disinformation campaigns can be harmful, and we don't really have laws in place to deal with them. And some of the stuff that you're talking about is tantalising, but it'll only be in the tasting of the pudding that we'll see whether they work. And those include, firstly, the introduction in recent years of the E-Safety Commissioner. We've seen that specialist role employed to try and tackle misinformation and disinformation, but with mixed success so far. We've seen ACMA's role increased, and ACMA taking greater interest in this. But typically the regimes that are established, firstly, are co-regulatory, so they require a certain amount of cooperation from industry. And you can see with online players, you've got X on the one hand fighting the E-Safety Commissioner in a whole lot of forums. At the same time, you've got, whether through public pressure or commercial pressure or some of these laws coming into place, Instagram introducing of their own volition child-based Instagram service which has age verification requirements. Now, I've got a 12-year-old, I think it'll take him about 8 seconds to get around it, but at least you can see it's an attempt to introduce these things in a way that sees the writing on the wall, not only because of the politics and the commerciality, but also because of the introduction of these laws. And I think co-regulation is essential, because whatever laws we introduce are going to run up against the reality that this is an international challenge. It's one where we can learn from what other jurisdictions are doing, whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, to a lesser extent the US, where things seem to be running their own show. In those situations, we not only need to learn from the kind of regulation that's being applied in those jurisdictions, but also to think about how our regulation is going to work in those other jurisdictions and how we can apply it. And without some cooperation or some recognition by these international entities that they do have to be responsible within our jurisdiction, they can ignore to a large extent both the penalties, which can be huge. They talk about percentages of profit per day for transgressions. They can be ignored because of jurisdictional issues. They can't be enforced in the US, where a lot of these companies are registered. But if they do have an interest in being a player in Australia, in respecting our laws, and there's plenty of entities, including clients and people that I act for, who do respect Australian defamation law, respect Australian court orders, respect Australian suppression, then we've got an opportunity to introduce law that might work in a way that is cooperative and sensible and productive.
Well, look, thanks so much, Kevin. I mean, I think it's good to have some sort of sense that there is a constructive kind of future here, but also I think something I really took from what you just said is just how complex the problem is, and this issue that it's a transnational or a global problem in a way, right? It's not one that Australia can deal with on its own. So that involves some real challenges around coordination, as well as that sort of extra layer of, how do we encourage private actors to take on sort of public interest responsibilities in the way that perhaps the traditional media have at least been sort of more explicit about.
And the big challenge is that we have all of these products coming from an international jurisdiction. So TikTok is supposedly from China, depending on how you trace the ownership. Almost all of the mainstream social media products are based in the US, and they have freedom of speech so high up on the totem pole that it is very hard to see those companies without a serious adjustment coming into line to meet the expectations of those countries that have a little bit more of a balanced approach, that appreciate that freedom of speech is important, and we need to make sure all of these regulations that we introduce don't make unnecessary inroads into freedom of speech, and it's a balancing act, but it's not the balance that the US would set, because they're a little nuts on this point.
Look, and I think that free speech dimension, it's one of the big sort of tensions and sort of problematics, as well as one of the key kind of areas for protection and concern. And that's maybe a good point too, because I know we've probably got about 5 more minutes, but I really do want to come to Ben now, as the journalist on the panel as well, to reflect on how he and his colleagues at The Guardian have tried to respond to this question of misinformation, and really to try to draw out this sense that perhaps, thoughtful, reflective media can be a part of the solution. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about through the whole panel and learning about is, in some ways, that this problem is a problem of information more broadly, and where we look for information, how that's changing, and how messy our kind of informational landscape has become. Ben, did you want to kind of help us think through some of the ways in which you and your colleagues are kind of trying to adjust to these aspects?
Yeah, look, excuse me, sorry, I certainly think we have, but I don't know that the media has done a very good job in responding to this misinformation. I think, like a lot of us, the media industry, the traditional media has just been sort of bewildered by it, and this sort of torrent of information has rushed over us. We have seen the emergence of sort of new formats of news. So we have things like fact checks, we have things like explainers, which are really unvarnished factual reportage to say these are the basic facts from which this issue sort of, that lie at the bedrock of a particular issue. And I think they're quite useful, sort of, we call them evergreens, evergreen stories that can sort of sit on the side of another news story to sort of say, these are the basic facts. This is an explainer of this issue. These are some sort of fundamental underpinnings that are sort of fact checked and verified, and that we can work off. Because I think the media has decided that there's merit in this sort of avowed fealty to truth, in factual, unvarnished, unopinionated news reportage. We've seen the media in this campaign in particular make the decision that somebody like the former President Donald Trump needs to be fact checked in real time, and we saw that in the debate with Vice President Harris. But I still think that's one man in one context, and we've still got this massive misinformation sort of overwhelming traditional media channels. I think there is a move, I suppose, and I thought Kevin's point was really evocative, that you're watching everybody on the bus just scrolling through half a second of information, and this kind of overwhelming this information, and almost no assessment going on as to the quality or the veracity of that information. But we are seeing a move towards slow media. We're seeing companies like Tortoise Media doing very well, particularly in the UK. The rise of podcasts is really interesting. You asked me this in the preview, Daniel. A podcast's a way to push back against misinformation, and my initial answer was no, and then it was yes, and now it's a kind of maybe, I suppose, because I don't see podcasts as being sort of categorically different in the realm of misinformation or disinformation. You can do an hour-long podcast and still speak utter rubbish and misinformation all the way throughout. But what they can be useful for is sort of cutting through the noise and dedicating attention to one issue and unpacking that, to properly debunk and to understand an issue. But then again, you've got to try and get to that person on the bus who's flicking through TikTok and ask for an hour of their time to really understand an issue, to Megan's point, to really understand what the voice from the heart is about, to do the reading, to do the background. And it's how you reach people and say, this is a really important thing, not just for you, but for the society you live in, to engage with it. There are rights in a democracy, but there are also responsibilities, and to kind of engage with these broader debates to understand this information is really important. And I don't think media has done a great job yet in kind of impressing upon our readers and listeners and viewers the importance of these debates, and saying, look, I know I'm asking for half an hour of your time. I'm asking you to read 1,500 words, but this is really important. And we've just got to keep trying, I suppose, to kind of cut through.
Look, I think that's really powerful. Of course, I was about to connect anyway with you on that point.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to make the point that there is some kind of, there are things that we can do. I accept that referendums are very specific, but the Aboriginal communities did press upon Labor to pass legislation to protect the referendum from lies and misinformation. That is what we did. And they chose not to. And they've since proposed various bills, and I accept that, combating misinformation, disinformation. But it was a very strong opinion of the committees that there would be law reform regarding the pamphlets, which is a required part of the referendum process. And the pamphlets aren't required to be fact-checked. So we had, we had pamphlets in every household in Australia that contained outright lies to inform voters. That's not okay. That's not fair. It's not democratically okay. We had to rely on fact checkers, as Ben said, RMIT, independent fact checkers, who were all then problematized by Advance as being all sorts of things. And so the fact checkers were kind of problematized and swept up into the misinformation as well. And so it's important to ask the question, and certainly in relation to referendums going forward, what role the law can play in terms of Australians being able to debate these issues fairly with appropriate information put in front of them that isn't lies and misinformation. And we did try, as First Nations people who were represented to be on those committees, to have that passed. Because of course we want to value, we value and we want freedom of speech. We want to protect it, but we need to balance that, of course, with upholding, as Ben said, principles of democracy and democratic rights. And to that end, I just want to add one more thing, and that is it's a shame that not enough discussion was had around the way in which racism and race speech and hate speech was so tolerated during that debate. And that had a huge impact upon our people. And all of the regulatory system that is meant to come into play in relation to that didn't. And it also wasn't identified as a major issue by the media. They missed the pamphlet issue. They missed the fact-checking issue. These are serious pieces of law reform. And, while they're running off in one direction about all sorts of ridiculous Trumpian lies about the voice, for example, the 25 pages of the Uluru Statement, is very simple. Those extra pages were just conference documents. Our people wouldn't participate in the dialogues. They don't trust government, much like a lot of Australians. And so they wouldn't go through the process unless we committed to writing down word for word what they said. And so we invited people from across the political spectrum. Some people said far right things, some people said far left things, but we faithfully recorded it. That's how we got that deliberative process to the end. And instead it was framed as a Trojan horse. And that just got repeated by journalists and media agency over and over and over and over again until it just became a truth of all Australians that somehow this process that the Australian people had invited us into via the Parliament in 2011, that it was some sort of Trojan horse made up by our people. And so I just wanted to make those points because I think it's important to say there was something that we could have done last year, and the decision was made not to do it. We're all pleased that it's being taken seriously now, because we were at the coalface of what it looks like, the acute impact of just lie after lie after lie, and you don't have the means to control any of that. And as we've said in the past couple of days and weeks leading up to the anniversary, you just sit back and watch it all take place, and you're just a bit player on the side, and it's all out of your control.
Look, thanks so much, Megan, I think we can sort of, they're really powerful reflections to end. I think what's been a terrific session. I think it's always, the sign of a great panel when you want to keep going. I've sort of got more questions. I think so many interesting lines of reflection and connections have been made, and I'm really, really grateful to our 4 fantastic panellists, extremely distinguished kind of and experienced in all of these areas, and very generous in offering their expertise and knowledge, because I think actually this is one of those areas which has become very urgent for our democracy. And I think, even in terms of the way that I've been teaching media law, in the classroom, those kind of democratic themes, which you can sort of, sometimes just, move through quite quickly at the beginning of term, are really sort of playing out in interesting ways in the discussion. So I guess at this stage, I'd really like to offer the formal vote of thanks, particularly to our brilliant panellists, Scientia Professor Megan Davis, Associate Professor Alyce McGovern, Kevin Lynch and Ben Doherty. Events like these highlight the great strengths of our community at UNSW Law and Justice and help to showcase both the impact of our research and also the achievements and expertise of our alumni community and students. And it's really been marvellous, I think, to be able to gather here tonight as a community to discuss these really important issues, and they are really significant ones. And I want to acknowledge the support of the faculty more broadly. Many of our colleagues are here, many of our students and alumni are here as well, but also our Dean, Professor Andrew Lynch, for supporting this event. In particular, a very special thanks are owed to our colleagues Anne-Marie Dobner and Kelly Cork, who've done so much behind the scenes, and also with all of us sort of very much front of house as well to organise this evening and ensure its success. I'd also like to thank the technical team, Zach and others involved for their help in making this truly a multimedia event. It's always my great fear with any discussion of media that the tech doesn't work, but it's worked a treat. And thank you, Megan and Ben, for also working with us across through like zooming in and working with us from different locations. That's really been a huge part of the success of it. I'd also like to thank the catering team for looking after us in the remaining hour. So there is a bit of time now to continue these discussions, which I look forward very much to. Sorry, Ben and Megan, we won't be able to share those with you, but we look forward to doing so again before too long. And I'd just like to thank all involved, and of course, thank our audience. You've been fantastic, and this event wouldn't be possible without you as well for coming to share in this legal hour. So thank you all.
Thank you.